Explaining how the duplication machine in The Prestige might not actually duplicate anything is the sort of fan theory that doesn't take more than a few minutes to explain. The real challenge, as far as I'm concerned, isn't explaining the theory, it's in figuring out why it might matter. Why should we care? After all, if you've enjoyed The Prestige for this long without some weird headcanon knocking around your brain case, then clearly you don't need the headcanon in order to enjoy the film. So why bother?
Man's reach exceeds his imagination.
Are you watching closely? Because that right there was the pledge. So before we dive in, I just want to make clear that I am by no means the originator of this idea. It's been on Reddit since before the film came out, and the only reason I started thinking about it at all was because I read an interview with Chris Nolan in which he refused to deny that it was a possibility. There are even other YouTubers who've covered the theory, but I'm hoping I can add just a bit more to the discourse in an effort to justify the existence of this particular explanation. In the interest of time, I'm going to assume that each and every viewer is already pretty familiar with The Prestige. This ain't no introductory course. It's an AP class. No time to recount the whole plot, but I do want to go over the parts that'll be important for this video. Ostensibly, The Prestige tells the story of two rival magicians who start off as friends, then become professional rivals, and then fully fledged criminal adversaries as they take increasingly hostile action towards each other in a never-ending quest to pull off bigger and better tricks. When Alfred Borden seemingly wins the fight by pulling off the greatest magic trick that anyone's ever seen,
It was the greatest magic trick I've ever seen.
Robert Angier decides if he's gonna top it, he might as well resort to some real magic. So with the help of Nikola Tesla, Angier incorporates a machine into his act that can duplicate anything it touches, be it hats, cats, or living, breathing, huge axe, which allows him to stage an even more spectacular version of Borden's transported man trick, but only at the cost of murdering a clone of himself each and every night that he performs. And by that point, it's not enough for Angier to simply best Borden on stage. As a final twist of the knife, Angier uses his last performance to frame Borden for murdering his clone, assume a new identity, take custody of Borden's daughter, and see Borden hanged for the non-crime he didn't commit. Jesus Christ. What an ending. Except that's not the ending. We still don't know how Borden pulled off his version of the trick. In the very last scene of the film, Angier visits the warehouse where he keeps all of his transported man paraphernalia, when he's suddenly shot in the gut by none other than Alfred Borden's secret identical twin brother. As Angier bleeds out, the two men trade barbs and goodbyes, and Angier takes the opportunity to affirm that everything he did was all worth it in the end.
But if you could fool them, even for a second, then you got to see something very special. It was the look on their faces.
One of his last acts on Earth is to encourage Borden to take a wider look at the room, his personal collection of proof that he's made sacrifices to get where he is, but Borden declines and leaves him there to die. But the camera lingers, and Cutter's somber narration plays us out.
Now you're looking for the secret. But you won't find it because, of course, you're not really looking. You don't really want to work it out. You want to be fooled.
As twisty-turny as the plot ever gets, by the end of the film it certainly seems like everything's been tied up nice and neat for us. In fact, it seems pretty airtight. A flashback in the final scene shows us the first time Angier ever duplicated himself, which results in the immediate murder of his own clone.
No, wait, I'm not...
Angier then says that the hardest part of performing the transported man was never knowing whether he'd be transported up onto the balcony or fall down and drown each and every night that he performed.
It took courage to climb into that machine every night, not knowing if I'd be the man in the box or in the Prestige.
These two moments would appear to offer unassailable proof that the duplication machine works exactly as advertised. But those last lines always bugged me. You're not really looking for the secret. You don't really want to work it out. You want to be fooled. Fooled how? Fooled by what? That's what I was wondering when I left the theater after my first viewing, and it wasn't long after that when I read the Chris Nolan interview where he refused to deny that the duplication machine never duplicated anything. And I haven't been able to stop thinking about it ever since. But if the duplication machine really is just an elaborate prop, that begs 3 immediate questions. 1. Why would Angier lie about the machine's capabilities in the first place? Even on his deathbed, why keep up the ruse? What's his motivation? 2. Is there any evidence in the film itself to suggest that Angier's lying? Anything more concrete than mere speculative headcanon? And 3. How the hell could Angier pull this off without a real duplication machine? In true Chris Nolan fashion, I am going to answer these questions in the reverse order that I pose them. So first up, how the hell did Angier pull this off without a real duplication machine? Well, we'd already seen him pull off a simpler version of the trick earlier in the film, with the help of a lookalike, the hapless part-time actor and full-time drunkard Root.
I have been Caesar. I played Faust. How difficult could it possibly be to play the great Danton?
Angier only abandoned this version of the trick because he got sick of ending the night below stage while Root soaked up all the glory. All he'd need to change in order to perform the final version of the trick with Root would be to teach him one measly line,
Man's reach exceeds his imagination,
and learn to be okay with taking his bows beneath the stage. It might even be worth it just to finally pull the wool over Borden's eyes.
Why can't you outthink him?
On the night of the last performance, Angier could have simply swapped places with Root. Maybe he told him he wanted to be the one up in the balcony for the final night, and then replaced the cushion beneath the stage with the water tank. Root would have then fallen into the tank instead of Angier, which would go a long way to explain the surprised look on his face. And then Angier could have simply disappeared into his new identity and let Borden take the blame for Root's death. It's perfect. As for those 2 unassailable proofs in the final scene, these are just 2 bits of information that Angier is spoon-feeding to Borden. He could simply be lying. We'll talk motivation in a bit. Right now we're just covering the possibilities. The only other loose end is the room full of Angier lookalikes in the final shot of the film. Dozens of water tanks, each filled with a dead Angier clone. How do we explain these without a functioning duplication machine? Well, is that what's in them? Dead Angier clones? Are we sure? I only see one clear shot of what looks like an Angier in one of the tanks. All the rest are obscured or opaque. But even assuming all the other tanks are just props, we'd still need to explain this one. Root's lying dead at the coroner's office, and Angier Prime is bleeding out a few feet away. So if this isn't Root or Angier, who is it? What is it, if not a clone? Well, it could be a wax sculpture. I know, that's stupid. Like, really, really stupid. Not to mention disappointing, right? I mean, why trust anything you see in the film if it can all be explained away by something that random? But then, hadn't we already been told multiple times throughout the film that the secrets to these tricks are always necessarily disappointing?
Once you know, it's actually very obvious.
That a disappointing secret is actually baked into the trick-making process?
The secret impresses no one.
That the more impressive the trick, the more disappointing the explanation must needs be?
I'm sure beneath its bells and whistles, it's got a simple and disappointing trick.
Most disappointing of all, sir.
I'm not saying it's definitely a wax sculpture. I'm just saying that's exactly the sort of disappointing explanation I would expect from a trick this impressive. Okay, so maybe it is possible for Angier to pull off this trick without a real duplication machine, even in just a conjectural, spitbally kind of way. But is there any evidence of the film itself to suggest that that's what he actually did? Well, there's very little. But more than none. Let's go back to the scene where Robert Angier is first put upon the idea of contacting Tesla, because that's not something he thought of for himself. Angier kidnaps Fallon and then holds him hostage until Borden agrees to provide him with his method for performing the transported man.
Write down your method, Mr. Borden. Describe it in full.
And in response, Borden writes down a single word: Tesla. Angier then zips off to America, whereupon Tesla builds him his machine. But hold on, Tesla wasn't Borden's method of performing the transported man. That was a lie. He just used a twin, not some machine.
Tesla is merely the key to my diary, not to my trick. Did you really think I'd part with my secret so easily after so much?
So what was Borden doing when he wrote down the word Tesla? Well, lying, obviously, but why that lie? Well, I assume Borden wanted to send Angier on some wild goose chase. Send him down some stupid rabbit hole to waste as much time as possible, which he'd been known to do to Angier before.
Goodbye, Angier. May you find solace for your thwarted ambition back in your American home.
But then what are the odds that Borden sent Angier on some random fetch quest which just so happened to bring him to the one person who could actually help him replicate the trick?
Have you eaten, Mr. Angier?
Like, what are the odds of that? So remote that it almost feels like a plot hole. But what if, after Borden wrote the word Tesla, Angier didn't go to America? Or maybe he did, but not to buy a duplication machine. What if he only went, or claimed he went, just so he could tell Borden a story about how sending him on some wild goose chase actually provided him the ultimate method of besting Borden? Wouldn't that be so deliciously spiteful? Which is certainly in keeping with what we'd seen of Angier before.
Yes, you, Borden. Sitting there in your cell, reading my diary, awaiting your death for my murder.
Yes, I am. I always have been.
Okay, so maybe it is possible that Angier never really had a real duplication machine. And maybe there's more than no evidence to suggest that that's what happened in the actual film. But why? Why would Angier lie about all this? What does he get out of pretending to perform real magic? Well, I think the answer depends on what we think Angier's ultimate goal was. Angier wanted to pull off the greatest magic trick that Borden ever saw, but I don't think simply conning Borden qualifies, especially through the use of so-called
Real magic.
Because here's my thing. If you use real magic, it's not a trick. The trick is only ever making someone believe it's magic. I know that sounds like just a bunch of nitpicky semantics, but recall Angier's final words.
The audience knows the truth. But if you could fool them, even for a second, then you got to see something very special. It was the look on their faces.
The delight is in the deception. How many times were we told throughout this film that explaining the trick isn't the fun part?
The secret impresses no one. The trick you use it for is everything.
It's not about making stuff disappear, or even reappear. It's about fooling people into thinking that they can. And while it's one thing to fool a paying audience, a group of people who've agreed to suspend their disbelief, fooling Borden is a whole nother animal. He's a fellow practitioner. He never suspended his disbelief to fool him against his better judgment, against everything he knows about the craft. That right there is the single greatest trick that Angier could ever pull. I think it's especially telling that it wasn't enough for Angier to simply frame Borden. He had to do it in such a way that Borden didn't even know how he was framed, save through magic.
I don't know what you've done.
You'd think Angier would be inclined to finally spill the beans when suddenly confronted by a second Borden here at the end of his life. But not necessarily. I think it's entirely in keeping with Angier's character to try and pull off one final trick. To fool the second Borden into thinking that he'd killed himself 99 times with the help of a magical cloning machine, when all he'd really done was murder one lone associate and commission a single elaborate prop. It might sound like the elaborate prop story would actually be more satisfying to tell, but again, the delight is in the deception.
But if you could fool them, even for a second, then you could make them wonder.
So this is where most explanations for the theory usually end, and to be fair, we are done explaining how the theory works. We've covered the means, we've covered the motive, and the opportunity, and yet I can't help but feel like the explanation is still missing something. Even a cursory attempt to explain why anyone should care. Kind of all feels like just a bunch of chin stroking at this point. What if nothing was as it seemed? What if lies about lies, and mind games within mind games?
The myth as we know it, yes, is busted.
Well, okay, but so what? If you wanted to get all metaphorical, or even meta-cinematic, you might say that all we've done so far is make the original ending disappear. But if the movie's taught us anything, we still have to bring it back. The Prestige works without any headcanon because I think the primary appeal is in watching the tale of two men, well, really three men, driven mad by their petty selfishness and all-consuming desire for revenge. That's the story we've all been loving since the film first came out. Absent any theories about what's really going on, that's where the catharsis comes from.
You go live your life in full now, right? You live for both of us.
Now, plenty of inkwells have been spilled about how the Prestige is all one big metaphor for storytelling. Chris Nolan's attempt at the same sort of thrilling deception that Robert Angier pulled off, but with a much lower body count, which is how most people try to link the fan theory back to the themes of the actual film. That's all well and good, but if you ask me, this sort of analysis doesn't reinforce the existing themes of the film. It transforms the film into a metatextual commentary on the craft of storytelling itself. Which is fine, but that's not what I want from this film. I want a story about the corrupting influences of petty jealousy, because that's where the catharsis comes from. As far as I'm concerned, the fan theory makes for a great term paper, but it's not really worth committing to memory unless it reinforces the tragic foundational premise of the film. I want headcanon that makes me feel more catharsis, not less. And, well, I wouldn't have made this video if I didn't think it does. Right before Angier dies, he invites Borden to take a wider look at the room.
You didn't see where you are, did you? Look.
At the menagerie of evidence that he's made sacrifices to get where he's got. Assuming the fan theory is true, this is a key moment in Angier's attempt to fool Borden into thinking he can pull off real magic. He's got to show him the proof that he's been using a real duplication machine. But first he's got to get Borden to look, to pay attention, to watch, to inspect the elements. But Borden declines. For all of Angier's careful planning, for all of his backup plans within backup plans, despite the extraordinary lengths he's gone through to pull off a trick within a trick within a trick, he fails.
Look.
Angier doesn't pull off the greatest magic trick that Borden's ever seen, because Borden's done looking. He's got better things to do than cling to petty grudges. And that's the single greatest comeuppance I could ever imagine for a murdering showboat like Angier. That's right, murderer. Not some master storyteller whose genius you gotta pay for with a couple of lives every now and then. You know, I usually tell people that The Dark Knight is my favorite Chris Nolan film, but I've definitely seen The Prestige more times, so who knows. I think The Prestige is Chris Nolan's most subtle and mature take on ethics. I love what it has to say about corruption and redemption without necessarily selling itself as a story about morality. This isn't a superhero film, it's a horror movie.
Dear God.
I love that it starts with Borden as the bad guy and Angier as the good guy. But by the end of the film, they've sort of swapped places. By which I mean their true natures have been revealed through circumstance. It's a swap that begins in the marketing campaign, when the trailer clearly sets you up to think that Borden's the bad guy who can do real magic.
This was built by a man who can actually do what magicians pretend to do.
Real magic.
But then you watch the film, and it's the other way around. Hell, maybe on some level, I don't even want to convince anybody that the duplication machine never duplicated anything. Because I bet that's exactly what Angier would have wanted. For all I know, that's why Chris Nolan never confirmed it either. Because why give Angier that much credit? Sure, he'd be at war with his own protagonist at that point, but then I guess everybody wins. Because how can you get more meta-cinematic than that?
There's no business like show business, like no business I know. Everything about it is appealing. Everything that traffic will allow. Nowhere could you get that happy feeling when you are stealing that extra bow. There's no people like show people. They smile when they are low. Yesterday they told you
Are you watching closely? Because that right there was the pitch. Shit, pledge. Are you watching closely?